The morning sun cast golden shadows across Table Bay as the merchant vessel Amersfoort dropped anchor in the pristine waters. The date was March 28, 1658. To the casual observer, it appeared to be just another Dutch trading ship seeking respite after months at sea. But hidden within the vessel's cramped, fetid hold lay a cargo that would forever stain the soul of this breathtaking peninsula. 170 human beings, chained, broken, and torn from their homelands. Captain Willem Willemsch had not intended to become a slave trader when he departed Amsterdam. His orders were simple: sail to the East Indies, conduct honest trade, return with profit. But 3 months earlier, off the coast of West Africa, fate, or perhaps something far more sinister, had intervened. A Portuguese slaver, heavy with 500 souls stolen from Angola, had crossed their path. The Dutch, with superior firepower and maritime skill, had seized the vessel without hesitation. Of those 500 human beings, fathers, mothers, children who had awakened free just months before, only 170 survived the nightmare voyage to Cape Town. The rest lay beneath the Atlantic's waves, their dreams and voices silenced forever. Yet as the Amersfoort's crew prepared to auction their human cargo on the shores of what would become one of the world's most beautiful cities, they could not have imagined they were laying the foundation stones of a system of oppression so brutal, so methodically engineered, that its shadows would darken South Africa for centuries to come. Today, millions of tourists stroll along Cape Town's magnificent waterfront, marveling at Table Mountain's majesty and the pristine beaches that stretch toward the horizon. But beneath this postcard-perfect paradise lies a history so dark, so systematically buried, that even now, most visitors leave without understanding the true cost of this colonial jewel. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. The arrival of the Amersfoort was not merely a single tragic event. It was the beginning of a systematic dismantling of entire civilizations that had thrived at Africa's southern tip for over a millennium. What unfolded in Cape Town between 1652 and 1840 was not accidental colonization, but methodical cultural genocide executed with corporate efficiency at stake. Was nothing less than the complete erasure of indigenous sovereignty. The Khoikhoi pastoralists, who had developed sophisticated grazing systems and governed themselves through intricate clan networks for countless generations, faced total dispossession. The San hunter-gatherers, whose rock art and spiritual traditions stretched back thousands of years, confronted systematic extermination. And tens of thousands of human beings from across the Indian Ocean world, from Angola's highlands to Madagascar's villages, from India's coasts to Indonesia's islands, would be reduced to property, their children born into bondage, their languages forbidden, their gods outlawed. But why does this buried history matter today? Because the systems of oppression engineered in colonial Cape Town did not end with the abolition of slavery in 1834, nor with the fall of apartheid in 1994. The spatial segregation visible in Cape Town's sprawling townships, the economic inequalities that divide the mother city, the intergenerational trauma that still echoes through communities, all trace their roots to the 5 dark realities we are about to uncover. These are not abstract historical lessons. They are the blueprints of institutional racism, the DNA of systematic exploitation, carefully documented in colonial archives, yet deliberately obscured from popular memory. Understanding how Cape Town became a laboratory for human oppression reveals how beautiful places can harbor the darkest secrets, and why confronting this truth remains essential for genuine reconciliation. The stakes could not be higher: the soul of a nation, and the question of whether historical truth can finally triumph over comfortable myths. To understand how Cape Town became a crucible of human suffering, we must first grasp the global forces that converged at Africa's southern tip in the mid-17th century. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Company, or VOC, was not merely a trading enterprise. It was the world's first multinational corporation, wielding quasi-governmental powers that included the authority to wage war, execute prisoners, negotiate treaties, mint currency, and establish colonies across 3 continents. By 1650, the VOC controlled a maritime empire stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to the Spice Islands of Indonesia. Their ships carried more than goods. They transported enslaved human beings as routinely as they hauled pepper and cinnamon. In Batavia, Ceylon, and the Malabar coast, the company had already perfected the machinery of exploitation, forced labor, territorial conquest, and the systematic destruction of indigenous political systems. Cape Town would become their masterpiece, but the Cape was not empty when Jan van Riebeek's 3 ships, the Dromedaris, Rager, and Goud Hoop anchored in Table Bay on April 6, 1652. For over 1,000 years, Khoikhoi pastoralists had moved their cattle across these fertile valleys in carefully orchestrated seasonal migrations. Their society was sophisticated. They possessed complex astronomical knowledge, maintained extensive trade networks reaching deep into the African interior, and governed themselves through democratic councils where women also held important roles. The San, hunter-gatherers, had an even deeper connection to this land. Their ancestors had lived here for tens of thousands of years, developing an intimate understanding of every plant, animal, and water source. Their spiritual beliefs were woven into the very landscape. Every mountain, every river, every cave held sacred meaning. Their rock art, scattered across the Cape's mountains, represented one of humanity's oldest continuous artistic traditions. Van Riebeek's initial orders appeared deceptively modest: establish a small refreshment station, grow vegetables for passing ships, trade peacefully with local inhabitants. The company explicitly instructed him to avoid territorial expansion and maintain cordial relations with indigenous peoples. But corporate appetites rarely remain modest, and the VOC's definition of peaceful trade would prove to be a death sentence for thousands. Within 5 years, what began as a handful of gardens had expanded into permanent European settlement. Former company employees, released from their contracts, received land grants along the Leesbeek River. Merino sheep and European cattle replaced indigenous grazing patterns. Dutch Reformed churches rose where Khoikhoi's sacred sites had stood. For generations, the transformation had begun not through conquest in the traditional sense, but through the more insidious process of economic displacement and legal manipulation. By 1660, the die was cast. The VOC had discovered that Cape Town's potential lay not in serving passing ships, but in becoming a laboratory for a new kind of colonial enterprise, one that combined territorial seizure, slave labor, biological warfare, and legal deception into a system so efficient, so thoroughly documented, and so morally devastating that it would serve as a blueprint for racial oppression for centuries to come. The first and most foundational lie of Cape Town's colonial history was the myth of empty land. Dutch records consistently portrayed the Cape as virtually uninhabited, a convenient wilderness awaiting European civilization. Yet Khoikhoi clans had established sophisticated grazing territories across these valleys for over a millennium, following seasonal migration patterns that maximized pasture while preventing overgrazing. Their land tenure system was complex, democratic, and sustainable, everything European agriculture was not. The collision came in February 1657 when the VOC granted 9 former employees land along the Leesbeek River. Company officials knew this territory belonged to the peninsular Khoikhoi, who had grazed their cattle there for generations. When Khoikhoi leaders protested, Van Riebeek dismissed their claims with chilling directness. The land would be farmed by Europeans whether the indigenous owners consented or not. Duman, a Khoikhoi interpreter who had witnessed Dutch brutality firsthand during his forced service in Indonesia, understood that peaceful resistance was futile. On a rain-soaked morning in May 1659, he led a coalition of clans in seizing 7 company oxen, hoping to force the colonists to abandon their farms and restore Khoikhoi grazing rights. The VOC's response revealed the true nature of colonial civilization. On May 19, 1659, the Cape's Council of Policy handpicked administrators and settler representatives convened an emergency session. Despite explicit company orders forbidding violence against indigenous peoples, the council unanimously resolved to launch a counterattack. Their instructions were genocidal in their clarity. Free burghers were ordered to seize or shoot the Khoikhoi on sight. The First Khoikhoi-Dutch War had begun. For over a year, Duman's forces employed brilliant guerrilla tactics, attacking during rainstorms when Dutch muskets could not fire. But superior European weaponry ultimately prevailed. By April 1660, the Khoikhoi signed a devastating peace treaty that ceded vast territories to the colonists. This was only the beginning. Two more wars followed in 1673 and 1674 through 1677, each ending with further Khoikhoi land losses. By the end of the 17th century, the myth of empty land had become reality, not because the land was ever empty, but because its original inhabitants had been systematically expelled, killed, or reduced to servitude. But stealing land was only the beginning of the horrors to come. Soon, the Dutch would steal souls themselves. The Amersfoort's arrival on March 28, 1658, marked Cape Town's entry into the global slave trade with industrial precision. But this was no isolated incident. It was the calculated beginning of a human trafficking network that would span 3 continents and destroy countless lives over the next 150 years. Within months of the first slave auction, the VOC had established systematic slaving routes across the Indian Ocean. Company ships departed Cape Town with instructions to purchase human beings from Madagascar's slave markets, Mozambique's coastal traders, and the war-torn regions of India's Coromandel and Malabar coasts. From Indonesia came skilled artisans and domestic workers, torn from families in Java, Sumatra, and the Celebes Islands. Each arrival brought fresh cargo of human misery. The numbers tell a story of staggering brutality. Between 1658 and 1807, 63,000 human beings were transported to Cape Town as slaves. By 1795, the colony's 16,839 enslaved people outnumbered the European population. These were not just statistics. They were mothers forced to nurse their masters' children while their own starved, fathers whose skilled craftsmanship built Cape Town's prosperity while they remained property, children born into bondage who would never know freedom. The VOC perfected techniques of dehumanization that would echo through centuries. The DOP system provided enslaved workers with regular wine rations throughout the workday, not as kindness, but as a calculated method of dependency and control. Enslaved women faced systematic sexual exploitation with zero legal protection. Colonial records reveal that not a single man, enslaved or free, was ever convicted of raping an enslaved woman. Despite abundant evidence of widespread abuse, the slave lodge in Cape Town became a symbol of institutional cruelty. Built in 1679, it housed hundreds of company-owned slaves in deliberately dehumanizing conditions. Families were separated by design, cultural practices forbidden, languages suppressed. The very architecture was designed to break spirits, narrow cells, minimal light, constant surveillance. Yet even as human bondage flourished on an unprecedented scale, enslaved people resisted with remarkable courage. Gallant van der Kaab led a revolt in 1825 after enduring repeated floggings. Dina escaped during the Boer's Great Trek, choosing uncertain freedom over certain bondage. Countless others committed suicide rather than submit, jumping from slave ships or refusing food until death. By the early 18th century, Cape Town had become the Indian Ocean's most efficient slave port, a human marketplace disguised as a refreshment station. Yet even as this trade in souls flourished, A more terrifying weapon was approaching, one that would make slavery seem almost merciful by comparison. On April 8, 1713, death arrived in Cape Town's harbor aboard a ship from India. Hidden in a bundle of contaminated laundry was smallpox, a disease that would accomplish what decades of warfare could not: the virtual extermination of the Khoikhoi people. The epidemic began among the colony's slaves, but European colonists possessed some immunity from centuries of exposure. The Khoikhoi had none. As the disease spread beyond Cape Town's boundaries, it encountered indigenous communities who had never faced this biological terror. The mortality rate was catastrophic. By February 1714, survivors reported that less than 10% of the southwestern Cape's original Khoikhoi population remained alive. But the horror lay not just in the numbers, it was in how systematically the disease destroyed Khoikhoi society. Entire clans vanished within weeks. Traditional leaders, the keepers of oral history and cultural knowledge, died in agony. Sacred rituals could not be performed because there were no elders left to remember them. Clan names, passed down through countless generations, simply disappeared. As their last speakers perished, the psychological warfare was as devastating as the biological. The Khoikhoi understood that this plague had arrived with the Europeans, and many believed the colonists had deliberately unleashed this evil upon them. Desperate families fled the peninsula with all their possessions, hoping distance might save them. But smallpox travels faster than oxen. As they sickened and died along their escape routes, other Khoikhoi groups, terrified of contamination, killed the fleeing refugees rather than risk infection. The cultural genocide was complete. Survivors lost not only their families but their very identity. With clan structures destroyed and traditional names forgotten, the remaining Khoikhoi became known only by the Dutch term Hottentots, a derogatory label that replaced centuries of proud clan heritage. Their sophisticated astronomical knowledge died with the elders. Their democratic governance systems collapsed without leaders. Their sustainable grazing practices vanished as colonial farmers seized the emptied lands. A second epidemic in 1755 completed the devastation, spreading all the way to the Kalahari Desert and eradicating the last independent Khoikhoi communities. By the end of the 18th century, European travelers described the Cape's interior as virtually uninhabited, not because it had always been empty, but because disease had accomplished what colonial records carefully called pacification. The efficiency was terrifying. Where warfare had taken decades to displace the Khoikhoi from small territories, smallpox accomplished continent-wide genocide in mere months. The Dutch had discovered the perfect colonial weapon, one that required no soldiers, left no European fingerprints, and cleared vast territories for immediate occupation. With indigenous resistance crushed and ancient societies reduced to traumatized survivors, the stage was set for an even more insidious form of bondage, one that would trap the remaining Khoikhoi children in a web of legal slavery disguised as Christian charity. By 1812, the few surviving Khoikhoi families faced a new horror that surpassed even smallpox in its calculated cruelty. Colonial authorities, recognizing that adult Khoikhoi could not be legally enslaved, devised a more insidious solution. They would steal the children instead, cloaking child trafficking in the language of Christian benevolence and legal apprenticeship. The instrument of this systematic child theft was an ordinance that granted magistrates sweeping powers to bind Khoikhoi children as apprentices to colonial farmers. The law's language was deliberately deceptive, speaking of education, moral instruction, and preparation for civilized life. The reality was slavery by another name, and colonial officials knew it. Historical records reveal that these apprenticeships created conditions little different from those of slavery, with children bound to masters until adulthood without wages, rights, or legal protection. The targeting was methodical. Magistrates would arrive at Khoikhoi settlements, often in the aftermath of smallpox outbreaks or seasonal droughts, identifying children whose families were too devastated to resist. Parents weakened by disease and dispossession watched helplessly as officials seized their 7- and 8-year-old children, claiming legal authority to provide proper Christian upbringing. The children disappeared into colonial farmsteads, forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their cultural traditions, or maintain contact with surviving relatives. These child slaves faced backbreaking agricultural labor from dawn to dusk. They herded livestock across the harsh Cape terrain, harvested wheat under the scorching sun, pressed grapes in colonial wine cellars, and performed domestic service in farmhouse kitchens. Unlike formerly enslaved people, they could not be sold, but they could not leave either. Masters held absolute authority over every aspect of their lives: diet, clothing, punishment, and even the right to marry upon reaching adulthood. The psychological warfare was devastating. Children who had survived the destruction of their clans now faced the erasure of their individual identities. They were forbidden to perform traditional coming-of-age ceremonies, denied knowledge of their ancestral territories, and prevented from learning the seasonal migration patterns that had sustained their people for centuries. Many forgot their original names, clan affiliations, and even their native language by the time their apprenticeships ended. The system's efficiency was diabolical. Unlike slavery, which required purchasing human beings, child apprenticeship cost colonial farmers nothing while providing decades of unpaid labor. Unlike warfare, which attracted unwanted attention from humanitarian critics in Europe, child apprenticeship appeared benevolent to distant observers. The perfect crime: genocide disguised as education, enslavement masquerading as charity. By the 1820s, an entire generation of Khoikhoi children had vanished into this hidden system, their labor building colonial prosperity while their cultural heritage died in silence. When British ships finally appeared on the horizon in 1806, many believed salvation had arrived. They were tragically, devastatingly mistaken. The Battle of Blouberg on January 8, 1806, brought British forces permanent control of the Cape Colony amid promises of humanitarian reform and civilized governance. Missionaries and abolitionists in London had painted the Dutch colonial system as barbarically cruel, promising that British rule would bring justice, equality, and Christian mercy to Southern Africa's oppressed peoples. The reality proved to be a masterclass in political deception. British colonial administrators immediately recognized the economic value of the systems they had inherited. Rather than dismantling the machinery of oppression, they refined it, adding layers of legal sophistication that made exploitation appear more humane while becoming more efficient. The child apprenticeship system continued unchanged. Past laws expanded. Territorial dispossession accelerated under the cover of frontier security and tribal pacification. The Great Betrayal came with slavery abolition in 1834. British propaganda celebrated this as humanitarian triumph, but the legislation contained a devastating provision: all formerly enslaved people would serve 4 additional years as apprentices to their former masters. The same chains, a different name. During this period, masters retained absolute control over their workers' labor, movement, and family lives while paying minimal wages that barely covered survival. Even more insulting was the compensation scheme. The British government allocated £1,200,000 to compensate slave owners for their lost property, but required claimants to travel to London to collect payment. Most colonial farmers, lacking funds for the journey, sold their compensation rights to speculators for fractions of the promised amounts. The economic disruption, combined with new English language requirements and Anglican church pressure, drove thousands of Dutch settlers to abandon the Cape in the Great Trek of 1835 to 1845. But the British innovation that would prove most devastating was the systematic expansion of past laws. Ordinance 49 required all African laborers entering the colony to carry employment contracts and identification passes issued by soldiers and missionaries. This was the birth of institutionalized movement control, the blueprint for apartheid's most hated system. Africans could no longer travel freely in their ancestral territories without permission from white authorities. Ordinance 50 briefly removed restrictions on Khoikhoi movement and employment, creating an illusion of liberation. That lasted exactly until labor shortages threatened colonial profits. By the 1840s, new master and servant laws imposed criminal penalties for breach of employment contracts, giving employers legal weapons to control African workers that were more effective than slavery itself. The British had accomplished something the Dutch never managed. They made systematic oppression appear humanitarian, legal, and civilized. They created institutions that would survive the end of formal colonialism, providing the legal foundations for decades of apartheid rule. These 5 dark realities: land theft through warfare, industrial slavery, biological genocide, child trafficking, and the deception of liberation, created a system so entrenched, so legally sophisticated, so economically efficient, that its shadows still darken Cape Town today. Stand on any hillside overlooking modern Cape Town, and the colonial blueprint remains starkly visible. The sprawling townships of Khayelitsha, Gugulethu, and Mitchell's Plain stretch endlessly across the Cape Flats, far from the city center. Economic opportunities. This is not accidental geography, it is the direct legacy of systematic spatial engineering that began with Van Riebeek's land grants and reached its conclusion under apartheid's group areas. The economic inequalities defining Cape Town trace directly to these colonial foundations. When slavery ended in 1838, formerly enslaved people received no land, compensation, or access to capital. Their descendants entered the 20th century with nothing but labor to sell, while families who built wealth through slave labor passed advantages across generations, creating today's persistent wealth gaps. The psychological wounds run deeper still. In communities descended from enslaved peoples and dispossessed Khoikhoi, cultural trauma echoes across generations. Languages vanished through systematic suppression. Traditional knowledge of medicinal plants, astronomical observations, and sustainable farming disappeared as elders died and children were prevented from learning ancestral wisdom. Even clan names connecting people to territorial rights were replaced by European surnames, marking ownership rather than belonging. Perhaps most enduring is the legacy in land ownership and spatial justice. Colonial practices of declaring indigenous territories vacant became the foundation for the Native Land Act of 1913, restricting African land ownership to 13% of the country. Today's debates over land redistribution are attempts to address injustices, beginning with those first VOC grants in 1657. These colonial systems proved so efficient and legally sophisticated that they became templates for racial oppression worldwide. Past laws developed in Cape Town influenced similar systems across colonial Africa. Cultural destruction techniques pioneered against the Khoikhoi were replicated globally. The Cape Colony became a laboratory whose experiments in systematic dehumanization exported poison across continents. The challenge facing modern Cape Town extends beyond acknowledging this history. It requires understanding how deeply these colonial foundations continue shaping contemporary life. True reconciliation demands confronting the ongoing legacy of systems designed to concentrate land, wealth, and opportunity while relegating the majority to permanent economic marginalization. Table Mountain stands eternal above Cape Town, its ancient stone bearing silent witness to centuries of human triumph and tragedy. The same winds that filled Dutch sails in 1652 now carry the sounds of 21st century life children playing in township streets. Waves breaking against shores where slave ships once anchored. Tourists marveling at beauty built upon buried bones. The 5 dark realities we have uncovered: systematic land theft, industrial slavery, biological genocide, legal child trafficking, and the deception of liberation, remind us that even the most beautiful places can harbor the deepest shadows. Cape Town's colonial past was not an accident of history, but a deliberate construction of human suffering, designed to concentrate power and wealth. Yet understanding this truth offers something more valuable than comfortable ignorance: the possibility of genuine transformation. Only by confronting how systematically these injustices were engineered can we begin dismantling the structures they created. The Mother City's true beauty lies not in its stunning landscapes alone, but in its potential to become a place where historical truth finally illuminates the path toward justice. Some stories demand to be told, no matter how dark. This is one of them.